everyone. My name is Sarah Omar, and I'm an assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to our series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. David Powers, professor at Cornell University. You can find his full biography on this page. Dr. Powers, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Nice to be with you, Sarah.
So I'd like to start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your areas of research.
Okay, so let me go back to when I was an undergraduate and there was a language requirement, I passed through 2 or 3 different majors as an undergraduate, and my final choice was Near Eastern Studies, and there was a 12-course requirement, and I had taken all the courses that were available. And someone said to me, this is around 1971, why don't you take Arabic? And I think I responded by saying, why would I take Arabic? But I needed that course to satisfy the requirement, and I did take Arabic, and I'm very glad that I did. And that's really what got me going. If I hadn't taken that course, I wouldn't be here today. I went on to graduate school eventually, and I'd always had an interest. I mean, before I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to become a lawyer. And in graduate school, I sort of followed my interest by, trying to learn as much as I could about Islamic law. And I settled upon a thesis in which I was looking at sources from North Africa in the 14th, 15th centuries and examining how property passed from one generation to the next. And I noticed that there was a tension between how people were actually transmitting property from one generation to the next and what I'd learned about what the Quran says about inheritance and how property should be divided. And I was a year into the project, and I don't know, I just had this hunch, this strong feeling that I needed to learn about Quranic inheritance law before I could, satisfactorily explain what was going on in the 14th century. So I dropped my original project and went back to the Quran. It was there that I first encountered a very interesting word. The word is kalala. If anybody out there knows what it means, please tell me, because nobody else in the world knows what it means. And I came up with a hypothesis to explain. Traditionally, it's understood as referring to a person who dies, leaving neither parent nor child. And I thought it was a borrowing from Hebrew, Syriac, Akkadian, and that it meant a daughter-in-law. And I argued that that the original meaning was daughter-in-law, and that over time the meaning was forgotten and replaced with whatever it came to be understood as. And I published a book called Studies in Quran and Hadith back in 1986, in which I put forward that hypothesis. Well, now I could go back to my original thesis topic, which was the intergenerational transmission of property in North Africa in the 14th and 15th centuries. And I did that. I used a source called the Me'yar of Ahmad al-Wansharisi, a huge collection of fatwas issued by muftis in Tunisia, Morocco, Spain. And the question that I wanted to answer by looking at that source was, how did Islamic law operate in practice on the ground in a particular time and place? Because to the best of my knowledge, up until that point, few of any scholars had addressed that question. Everybody talked about fiqh, and legal theory and law and doctrine, but nobody had actually looked at least for the pre-modern period, had looked at how courts operate. So I ended up doing a series of 6 case studies there, which each one focused on the remarkable documents that are preserved in these fatwas. And I think that I was, able to show how Islamic law operated in practice in Morocco at that time, but also I was interested in dismantling the notion, stereotypes about Islamic law, in particular the idea there's the concept of Qadi justice that Weber had introduced, and Justice Frankfurter had said, "We do not sit like a Qadi under a tree dispensing justice off the top of our head without reference to any legal doctrine." And that was, and to a certain extent, still is the image, I think, of Islamic law in the West in particular. And one of my conclusions in this book, which was called Law, Society, and Culture in the Maghreb, was that there was nothing more important for Muslims than the reasoned justification of a court judgment. And I think I made that case pretty persuasively in that book. I didn't know what I was going to do next. And then in around the year 2005, so that's 15 years ago, two things happened. One is that a colleague showed me a facsimile edition of a very early Quran manuscript. It's in Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale de France. It's number 328A, I think. And it preserves chapter 4 of the Quran, Nisa, where that mysterious word kalala occurs that I'd written about in my dissertation 20 plus years ago and was done with. And I look at that page, and I could have shared, well, I could share this with you if you want, but there's a smudge. The word kalala is smudged. And as I recall, I looked at that smudge, continued looking at it for at least 6 months without thinking that there might be anything important about the smudge. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that someone had, I mean, it didn't occur to me that someone might have erased the original text and rewritten it in a manner that was different than what it was originally. That's what I had been trained to think about the Quran and how it came into being. So the first thing was I found that facsimile edition with the smudge. The second thing, I was wandering in the library here on Cornell's campus, looking for a book on Islamic law in the compact shelving area where you have to push a button and the shelves separate, and you go walk inside, and you're worried that the shelves are going to come back in on you. And I bent down and picked up a book, and it was the wrong book. In fact, and I have them here on my shelf, but it was two books, a Brill publication reference book, A History of Ancient Near Eastern Law, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And I went to the index because of my interest in Kalala, and there they have the root KLL, and that sent me to an article by an Italian scholar. And in the footnotes, he's talking about adoption contracts in Nuzi in the second millennium before the Common Era. And he cites the language of these adoption contracts. And Tupi is a document, Martuti Ukaluti, a document of daughtership and daughter-in-lawship. And the Kaluti is the equivalent of Kalala, the Martuti is the equivalent of Imra. And in the Quran, it says, in kana rajulun o imratun yurithu kalalatan. Anyways, the language is very close. The language of these adoption contracts from Nuzi, 1500 BCE, was remarkably close to the language of the Quran, but the Quran's not talking about adoption. So I started looking at the Quran, and I learned, I mean, I must have known this, but I hadn't paid much attention to it. I learned that Muhammad had an adopted son, and his name was Zaid. And he's mentioned in verse 37 of Surah Al-Ahzab. And in verse 40, which is 3 verses later, we have a famous assertion that Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but the messenger of God and the seal of prophets, Khatam an-Nabi. And when you go to the earliest commentators on this verse, like Muqatil ibn Sulaiman dies in 150. I found when he says this verse was revealed not about Muhammad, it was revealed about Zayd. Interesting. But he says, he asked the hypothetical, he says, if Zayd had continued to be Muhammad's adopted son, he, Zayd, would have been a prophet. Stunning statement. And so that got me looking at the doctrine of the finality of prophecy and Zayd. And I wrote, in 2009, I wrote a book called Muhammad's Not the Father of Any of Your Men, The Making of the Last Prophet. And then in 2014, I wrote the Zayd book. So that's more or less the progression from being an undergraduate back in the 70s to being here in the 2020 and whatever.
So thank you for that. I'm wondering, I mean, you've given us a picture of your research and your work and how it all connects together in a sense. And I'm wondering how the questions you've posed over time have changed, and how you're also, your approaches maybe and methods and potentially the theories that you've drawn on to address your questions have also changed as the fields that you're working within are changing over time.
Well, so I consider myself to be an historian, and I'm interested in change over time. And so my method is to look at texts and time periods, look at texts and phenomena, and try to trace their development over time. And that hasn't changed. And I hope it doesn't. But there have been changes. Generally, the first question that I was interested in back as a graduate student was, how did Islamic law develop over the first 100 or 200 years of its history? And I should say, and what I was interested in was possible interactions between the Arabs in the Hijaz and the non-Arabs, Muslims, Jews, Persians, Byzantines, others living in the Near East at the same time. And what connections, if any, might there be between the Quran and late antique texts, or between early Islamic legal thinking and late antique jurisprudence? And so that's a question that I was interested in back then, and I continue to be interested in now. And I think there's a lot more to say about that. I also became interested in what you might call intertexts. So when we were reading the biography of Muhammad and narratives about the early community, we have these reports, and if you read them carefully, I think that you can hear echoes of ideas that circulated in late antiquity, in Jewish texts, Christian texts, Byzantine texts, Persian texts, and other texts. And so I'm interested in those connections. I developed an interest in those connections. And I guess, so for example, with this notion of Khatam an-Nabiyyin, that Muhammad is the last prophet, recently published an article in Arabica about a month ago, in which, and this is based on research I've been doing for the past couple of years, and my working hypothesis is that the assertion that Muhammad was the last prophet makes better sense in a post-Muhammadan context than it does in Medina in the year up till the year 632. Muhammad, up until 632, Muhammad was trying to convince people he was a prophet, but to say that he was the last prophet, it's a bit of overkill. Well, it's interesting that Christian authors had been speaking about a last emperor for hundreds of years before Islam comes along. And this last emperor was a kind of a messianic figure who would go to Jerusalem And I think he would put the crown on the cross and would transfer his power to Jesus and usher in a 1,000-year millennium of peace and prosperity governed by religious law. Well, there's some interesting similarities. Possible connections between the idea that Muhammad, the Islamic doctrine of the finality of prophecy, and in this case, Byzantine doctrine of the last emperor. So that's something that I'm working on at the moment. But you wanted to know how my questions change over time. I would say that increasingly, as my career developed, I treat the sources for early Islamic history as literary narratives rather than as records of what really happened, rather than as repositories of facts. It's actually fun to do this. If you treat them as literary narratives, there's a lot of room for your imagination. But I think that's good. And then another change, maybe this is the last one that I'll mention, is that I increasingly think that it's important to combine the study of literary sources, historical chronicles, whatever, to combine the study of literary sources with material sources for the same period. So, I mean, and scholars are doing this with coins and buildings and all kinds of things. And with the Quran, it's important to look at the early Quran manuscripts. Those are the artifacts, and also to use technology to study these things. So when I eventually went to Paris to look at the manuscript, and I learned something about X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy. It's, students who are in the STEM part of the university can bring a lot to students who are in the humanities, and perhaps vice versa. And I think that's important as well. So yeah, that's kind of it.
Dr. Powers, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your intellectual journey. It's been really such a pleasure.
Thank you, Sarah.